So we were really worried about people falling asleep today, so we set the thermostat at 57. So you, I don't quite know why it's so cold, but I just saw one of our colleagues from DGS working the thermostat. So hopefully between that and the body heat that we generate, we'll be warming up. So first of all, thanks for joining us. My name is Wade Crowfoot, and I feel like I have the world's best job, which is being secretary here at the Natural Resources Agency. This is the third or fourth event like this we've done, and the whole idea is to bring in people from outside of the agency, outside of our departments, to share thoughts on emerging or high priority issues. And I can't think of any higher priority than keeping our communities safe in the age of catastrophic wildfire. Something that I've been educated to explain is that, in the last 2 years, we've lost 3% of our land mass to wildfire, and that is creating increasing danger across California. California has almost a quarter of our population, I think, that live in high hazard fire zones. I think a lot of us, when we think about those places, think about small rural communities in the Sierra Nevada and not suburban Los Angeles or San Diego or the Bay Area. And so while I think we as a state have done a very good job elevating the importance of community-oriented fuel breaks and vegetation management, I think we all recognize we can be doing more working with communities to actually build resilience within communities to these fires. I know our folks who are here today are expert on this and each come from a sort of slightly different angle on this. So I'm excited for provocative, direct conversation about what we can be doing, even more than we're already doing in California, to protect our homes and our communities. We have a great person. I've got a great person at the agency that I work with on these issues named Jessica Morris, who's our Deputy Secretary for all things forests, and she's going to facilitate the conversation today, so thanks.
So I want to give us just a little bit of context about what we're going to learn today. You'll see in the video a little bit about home hardening, which is where you're creating that defensible space and making sure that your home can actually survive wind-driven fires. And I had a firsthand experience of this a couple weekends ago during the high wind event. I woke up at 2:30 in the morning to the power line outside of my own home exploding and saw a nice giant ball of fire in the tree in front of my house. So after calling 911 and waking up all the neighbors, we had nothing to do but stand there and watch embers blowing directly onto my home and some of my neighbors. And I was amazed that it wasn't actually catching fire, even though leaves and twigs and all sorts of stuff were blowing on it. And I realized that my house was the model of a hardened home. I'd cleaned the gutters, I had a new roof, I had double-paned windows, cement walls. I'm super lazy, so all of my landscaping is rocks. And so my home survived a wind-driven fire. And I was really lucky. But a lot of people in our state are not so lucky. We have had tens of thousands of homes over the last several years burn in mega fires, and tragically over 140 deaths. So it is a catastrophe and a crisis that's upon us. And this isn't, these mega fires, the frequency of them, it's not normal. We've had a long history of wildfire in our state. It's part of our natural ecology. But gold rush era clear cutting, decades and decades of fire suppression created intense fuel loads that's now being compounded by not only people moving into wildland urban areas, but also climate change. These longer, drier summers, and the high winds that come with them without the rain. Any duck hunters in here? You know what I'm talking about. We're supposed to get rain in October. Where is it, right? And so when these winds come in without the rain, we end up with this phenomena of mega fires, which are growing more and more frequent. Of the 20 most destructive fires in California's state history, 10 of them have occurred in the last 5 years. So this is a crisis that is incredibly large. The scale of it cannot be underestimated, but the scale of our response, we are working to match it. So there are 3 areas that we need to work on at once to ensure that California becomes fire survivable and fire resilient. The three areas we really work on are, I like to think of them as sort of concentric circles of defense lines. And they have to happen all at once, otherwise we don't end up with a fire-resilient state. So the innermost circle is really that community. That's the hardened homes and the survivable spaces that we're gonna talk about today. The second layer is the wildland-urban interface. That's where we're doing fuel breaks and strategic fuel breaks like CAL FIRE's working on right now. The governor this year declared an emergency before the emergency and asked CAL FIRE to do 35 emergency fuel breaks and complete them within 1 year as opposed to 5 years, which is how long they can usually take. And so CAL FIRE's been working around the clock to do that for 200 of California's most vulnerable communities and really prioritizing this increased pace. And then the last circle, the outermost layer is really that landscape. This is where we're looking to restore California's watersheds, to restore our wildlands, to make sure that we're reducing that fuel load and returning the natural ecology back. And one of the tools we're using to do that is really working on eliminating green tape, making sure that we're upholding high environmental standards while expediting processes. So we've been working on something called the Cal VTP. It's a 20.3 million acre programmatic environmental impact review that does pre-CEQA reviews for many landscapes throughout the state and will allow landowners and land managers to efficiently get their projects into CEQA compliance, minimizing that time frame from 2 years down to just mere months. So we're really excited about a lot of the work the state is doing. And today I have an incredible group of panelists who are really going to zero in on what we're doing to keep communities safe and that aspect of home hardening. So I think the video's up, so let's watch that and then we'll introduce the great panel. Great, thank you so much, James. And thanks to CAL FIRE for putting together that great video. Now we're gonna pull up our group of panelists, and today you are gonna hear from people who have I think collectively, probably a good century of fire experience if you put them together. And we're going to hear about the science behind home hardening. We're going to learn about local grassroots community efforts. We're going to learn about what the state is doing to educate the public. And we're going to hear some lessons learned from people who have done home hardening programs and see if we can design something great for our state as well. So come on up, guys, and we'll get started. So our first panelist is Jana Vanek, who is the county director and forest advisor for the UC Cooperative Extensions in Humboldt County. So thank you for making the drive, first of all. And Jana is truly a scientist and an expert on home hardening. She's been doing a lot of the studies. She was the technical advisor for Assembly Bill 38, which the governor recently signed, creating a landmark process for the state to have a statewide home hardening effort. So Jana, we are thrilled to have you today. Thank you for making the drive. And Jana has brought some slides as well to talk us through, so I'll let you take it away.
Well, thank you for the invitation. It's a real pleasure to be with all of you today and for the interest in this important topic. I just wanted to start with this opening question of kind of what is the science behind home hardening, and to demonstrate that there is a good body of literature as well as educational materials that are available. So it's not just hearsay and innuendo. And this work comes through efforts of my colleagues, both at University of California Cooperative Extension, as well as the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety. So I want to talk a little bit about how homes burn from wildfire, and really to illustrate that most people have been thinking about direct flame contact as the means by which a home is going to become damaged or have a flame exposure. But really the real challenge is thinking about embers as well as radiant heat. So when your neighbor's home catches on fire, are you prepared to withstand that kind of heat exposure? And so the real recognition is this challenge of embers, which do not happen in every wildfire, but when they do happen, they can really find every vulnerability, every nook and cranny that you might see in a building. And this photo from Paradise, I think, shows how kind of overwhelming the process can be when you experience this onslaught of little bits of burning vegetation or materials from a home or building that have caught on fire. But these windblown embers are responsible for the majority of ignitions. And so here's an image from South Lake Tahoe in the Angora fire, where the vegetation did not really become involved, but the home was lost. So how did that happen? And so we have to think about the points of entry that are common and typical. So here are just a few images, and this is why I wanted to bring images, because it's hard to explain these roof-to-wall connections where you've got vegetation connected to the wall but on the roof, and you're asking the wall to perform like a roof, but it wasn't designed to do that. Or you have vegetation stuck in the rain gutter, and without a metal drip edge at the edge of the roof, then you have an easy entry point for fire inside the attic. Or the fence-to-house connection, where the fence catches on fire and wicks the fire to the building. Or most importantly, the ember entry via vents. And so these are two images on the bottom that show from the inside viewpoint of the building what those little flying sparks are, and our recognition now that we need to have much finer mesh screen, and there's been a lot of new technology changes. So I brought one illustration of one of these new kinds of vents, these new technologies that are available that can really make a substantial difference. So does this work? I have a bit of data here from Paradise, which is an interesting data set. There are more homes in Paradise that have experienced wildfire exposure than almost any other community in Northern California. The homes in Paradise are predominantly older, minus this data set of new homes just in the last decade. So when Paradise was exposed to this most recent campfire, the majority of them were older construction. But this small data set of about 140 homes since 2008 show that with the new changes, with the Chapter 7A of the Wildland Urban Interface construction standards, we made a significant difference. So the survival rate went up to 42% with the new construction versus somewhere in the teens in the previous decades. So this is really good news, but there are lessons to still be learned. Here is an illustration of a surviving home in Paradise that experienced significant damage. And I really want to bring this forward because you can see the illustration of the embers, the size of these embers. These were found in the lawn. You typically look at this image and say, wow, it had a nice green lawn all around the home building. It had a lot of cement. You know, what was missing in this equation? Well, what was missing and why every window was cracked, the first pane was cracked in this building, is because there were combustible mulch and woody vegetation planted right next to the building and right in front of each of the windows. And that it was receptive to those embers, and we had fires right next to this building, and that's what led to the damage to all of those windows. We saw the same thing here in the Carr fire. This is fairly close to where the fire tornado went through. Again, a moat of green grass, typical defensible space, but sure enough, there's damage to every one of those windows. So what I want to bring forward is this idea that we can do better, and we need to be thinking about defensible space in a much tighter framework. So between the significant changes that have come to the new construction codes, we have opportunity to try and figure out how we retrofit existing homes as well as create improvements in our overall design for dispensable space.
Thank you so much, Jana. I think that's really fascinating. And you were mentioning the improved codes, and we have Daniel Berlant here today with us, who is from the Office of the State Fire Marshal. He's a Deputy Assistant Director at CAL FIRE, and actually started with the State Fire Marshal when he was 18 years old, has had his entire career doing defensible space and working with communities on this. So Daniel's truly an expert on this. So Daniel, can you tell us a little bit about the history of home hardening, defensible space, and some of the redesigns to the fire code today?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, home hardening in the last couple of years has really become a buzzword, especially after the 2017 fires in Santa Rosa, the 2018 fire in Butte County. But in reality, we've been looking at how do we keep fire away from homes, and how do we protect not only structures, but those people that are in those structures for decades. And primarily that was through defensible space. If you haven't heard the term defensible space, that's vegetation clearance around a structure. That requirement has been around in the wildland-urban interface really for decades, and we've continuously refined it. In fact, in 2005, we made a major change, and the legislature extended the defensible space requirements from 30 feet to 100 feet. And the goal of defensible space is really to, you know, Jana had some pictures that showed kind of that green belt around the home, but the goal is to keep radiant heat from wildfires away from the structure itself. So those laws have been in effect for many years. They have saved countless homes. But unfortunately, as you kind of teed us off here, in this past decade, we've seen kind of a change. And it really started in 2003. We had a fire siege down in Southern California, dozens of fires all burning at the same time. And in those fires, over 3,700 homes, were destroyed by those fires. Huge numbers of subdivisions, particularly in San Diego County and other parts of Los Angeles. And so that's when the Office of State Fire Marshal really started to look at, well, what are the building materials that homes are built out of? And while that multi-year process was underway, another round of fires occurred in 2007. Couple dozen fires all burning at the same time, 3,100 structures destroyed in that fire. And so it really just kind of emphasized the need for us to really look at, well, how are we building our homes? What's the construction material? What's the assembly of those materials? And that's when the office and the state rolled out the 2008 Wildland-Urban Interface building standards. And in those standards, we looked at things like the siding, roofs, vents, double pane windows, a lot of the items that have already been mentioned. And that really took a real good stab, I would say, at hardening a structure itself. So now we have the radiant heat kept away by defensible space, and when you have ember ignition, where embers are raining down on these homes, and what we saw in some of these fire sieges, embers traveling up to a mile away from the head of the fire. So that's where you see subdivisions completely unrelated or in further proximity from the wildfire itself get destroyed because these embers find the weak points. So we needed to look at making sure that these building materials were ignition resistant. How could they withstand those embers landing on them, even with that defensible space. And so we've really, I think, changed our discussion, maybe in, I would say, almost a decade now, of the message being not just have defensible space, but make sure your home is hardened as well. And that's what really goes into play. But these building standards that I talked about, Chapter 7A of the Building Code, have been around for over 10 years. But those codes aren't stagnant. We're constantly looking at improvements. Unfortunately, the last couple of years, we've had massive destruction of homes, and we've been able to collect a lot of the data. A lot of the data that Jana has talked about, we've sent out inspectors, and maybe a couple decades ago, we would collect data of where the home was and how many were destroyed. But now we're looking at, well, what was that home specifically made of and what was remaining? So we could start to begin the analysis of determining the effectiveness of those codes. And so in the last couple of years, we've made some modifications. In the latest code adoption cycle, a couple examples that were just recently approved by the Building Standards Commission, new UL-listed garage door weathering strips. So we found that garage doors were a point of weakness. So we updated the code to make sure that the stripping around those garage doors wouldn't allow embers to get in. Another one is ember-resistant screens over openable skylights. So the point is that we're constantly kind of updating these codes to make sure that they're relevant. Because it's really important that we're not only addressing new homes, though, we've really been looking over the last several years at what do we do with the existing homes. The Secretary mentioned that we have a significant build-out in these high-hazard areas that were built before the code. So in the last several years, with legislative mandates, we've began working on a number of items. One of those is a low-cost retrofit list. One of the hurdles that people have when it comes to defensible space is really the fact, when it comes to home hardening, is that defensible space is relatively easier. It doesn't take as much money. It's not as cost. It doesn't cost as much money as, say, replacing a roof. But what are some of those items that Jana mentioned that don't cost a lot? And trying to make sure we're bringing that as part of the conversation. And so that low-cost retrofit list will come out early next year, and I think that's going to help really start to address those existing homes. Like I said, the codes are continuously changing.
Thanks, Daniel. That's great. We also have Callie Jane here today with us, who is the executive director of the Butte County Fire Safe Council. She's been there for 14 years. She is now a resident of Paradise, and so is well connected and understands the campfire intricately. Callie Jane also wrote a children's book called Once Upon a Wildfire. I think we've got some stacked in the back, so make sure you take a look at this. And I feel like this should be sort of the symbol of climate change, that we have children's books about wildfire today. But Callie Jane, can you talk to us a little bit about what a Fire Safe Council is and what you at the Butte County Fire Safe Council have done and some of your successes and some of the hurdles you've encountered?
Great. Good morning, everyone. Well, good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here with you. And the Fire Safe Council movement began out of the Oakland Hills fires in 1991, and there was an effort undertaken to encourage each county to have a Fire Safe Council, and every location throughout the state is different of who their strong players are as far as their resource conservation districts, their volunteer fire departments, etc. And so in Butte County, our Fire Council formed with a 17-member board of directors so that we could have a lot of collaboration across agencies and local communities. So our organization is celebrating its 21st year this year, and we really started to get steam in the early 2000s when the National Fire Plan funding came out to fund projects like roadside evacuation, safety, fuels reduction, and community preparedness. So since that time, we have developed our Community Wildfire Protection Plan, which is a common theme amongst most groups who are trying to do work within the WUI, and really leveraged our local communities' interest and passion. So we're a 501c3 nonprofit, but we have about 8 other small fire safe councils in our county that we support and partner with so that they can be even more grassroots in their communities and neighborhoods. And of course, Firewise USA program has evolved since then, and so we have a number of Firewise communities within our county in addition to that. So lots of folks involved in volunteering, planning, implementing projects. And along with the theme of implementing projects, we've had a lot of success bringing funding to the county to thin the forest and to do fuels reduction. And 3 of those I'll just share with you briefly. that performed during the campfire. The first was protecting drinking water for the town. So you may have heard that the town's water had some contamination issues, which was just a result of the pipes within the system itself that had some backflow. But the actual water that comes to the town is from a lake, and that lake we had done a significant amount of fuels reduction around in partnership with the Forest Service and Sierra Pacific Industries and Sierra Nevada Conservancy. And moral of the story is when the fire came through, it was able to slow down, drop to the ground, the trees survived, and the drinking water is protected. So now that I live in the town and I'm using the water, I'm really thankful for that.
That's great. I think we've got a picture of it. I have some of your slides up there.
Okay,
so
great. Okay.
just believe me. Yeah.
Okay, I believe you. The other is that we had planned a project for safety zone in case of evacuation out of the community of Concow, knowing that there was only one way out. And that was a project that we worked with the local Fire Safe Council there, Yankee Hill Fire Safe Council, and the Homeowner Association. Got some grant funds to remove dead trees from the prior fire of 2008 and mowed this meadow. And when the fire came into Concow early in the morning, the sheriff and CAL FIRE personnel brought citizens to the meadow. It was very dark, very smoky. They couldn't see well, and the fire burned through one side, and they moved into the other side of the meadow and sheltered there for a number of hours. And we know for sure that that project saved lives. And then lastly, we had a school in Magalia that we protected by thinning the forest out just a couple months before the fire came through. And we're really thankful to go out in that forest, and the tops of the trees are still green. Unfortunately, most of the homes in that area burned, but the school survived, and it's being used today.
That's great. I mean, I think that's really critical that you're taking some of the standards and lessons from CAL FIRE with Daniel's work on defensible space and the work on fuel breaks and strategic fuel breaks that CAL FIRE is doing to actually really execute that at the grassroots level and bring the community together to have survivable spaces and strategic fuel breaks that even in the face of a catastrophic fire like the campfire actually had an impact. And I think we have a picture of Paradise Lake up there, and I know you feel free to talk about your photos, but we'll come back to them. I guess we'll move on to Forrest. Forrest Shaffer is here with us today to really help us think through lessons learned. As we as a state are really looking at how do we scale up home hardening, the California Fire Safe Councils have estimated that there's about 2 million homes within these high fire zones that are in need of retrofits to be able to achieve a high standard of home hardening. And so after the Angora fire in Tahoe in 2007, Forrest and his team worked on using FEMA's mitigation dollars to actually help homeowners bring their homes up to a higher fire standard and do those home hardening retrofits. So Forrest is now with the Tahoe Conservancy and has had 15 years working on fire and wildland fire and is a registered professional forester. Forrest is a forester, and throughout the Tahoe Basin area. So Forrest, we're really happy to have your expertise, and I'd be really interested to hear your lessons learned because I understand that the program that you guys worked on both the California and the Nevada side had mixed results, and so I think it's really important that we build on those lessons. And can you tell us what worked well, what didn't, and maybe give us an overview of the program?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Jessica. It's great to be here today. I actually just realized I came from North Lake Tahoe Fire Protection District, where I was the forester. I now am the community forestry supervisor at the Tahoe Conservancy. I have a great track record of having forest in my job title. I hope I can keep that up. But a lot of my perspectives will come from having worked with a team of local fire protection districts where we work with the state, where we work with the U.S. Forest Service to really coordinate the effectiveness of our investments and what a state is well suited to do and what the federal government is well suited to do and what local jurisdictions really excel at, and really looking to align that work. And similar to what Daniel mentioned with the evolution of codes and really thinking beyond just defensible space and really thinking to the locus of the issue itself where those ignitions start within those homes, we had a similar realization after the Angora fire. You saw the picture that Jana displayed of the home in the Angora fire. Where the home burned down, it was surrounded by green vegetation. And so following that, we took forward, working with the local fire districts, to put together a basin-wide home hardening program. Naturally, these programs had to look a little bit different on each side of the state line, but in the end, it's really to raise the profile of the importance of conducting not just defensible space work, but to complement that with home hardening work. The program that I'll highlight is the program that was funded by FEMA, Federal Emergency Management Agency, Hazard Mitigation Funding. And with this, it was set up as an incentive program to really focus on what we saw as the primary vulnerability in a lot of our older homes, and those were wood shake roofs. And this provided a financial incentive that would cover 70% of a roof replacement cost, up to $6,500 for an individual home. And with it, 350 homes. This was about, in one fire district, 350 homes was half of all the homes in that fire district that still had wood shake roofs. And that program just successfully wrapped up with those 350 homes where a wood shake roof was replaced. There were a couple of lessons learned. I really want to focus on the positive piece first, is that the critical piece of this program is this wasn't just, hey, replace your roof, do this thing. There was a strong link on both the California and Nevada programs to, in order to have eligibility, in order to actually receive any incentive funding, it had to be defensible space had to be implemented by that resident up to a very high standard, which included things like the 5-foot non-combustible zone, which science is showing to be one of the most cost-effective retrofits available. And so we're really blurring that line where defensible space ends and home hardening begins, recognizing that they all need to act in concert with each other. One of the things we noticed, though, is that we certainly had a lot of people who replaced their roofs under the program who maybe didn't really need the financial incentive. That roof was aging out. Thanks to California's fire codes, any substantial replacement of a roof needs to be Class A or non-combustible. So we know we had those situations. We also had situations where people really wanted to replace their roofs. They understood the intention and the need, but they weren't even able to put up the minimum match funding of 30% in order to make that happen. But we know that in the middle, we had many cases where people were right at that cusp, and that was the critical incentive to encourage a roof replacement rather than just continual maintenance and repair. But in that, we think about how effectively we're serving with these programs the people who need the assistance the most. As we've seen with California fires in the last 3 years, areas where we never considered in Lake Tahoe would be really at risk of wildfire, our perception has changed for that. Some of our denser areas in the middle of town where we have many more full-time residents, those are going to be the people who feel the impacts of wildfire the most. And we're asking ourselves how we can more equitably deliver our services and align those services with the needs of the community. And then, how's my time?
Pretty much done.
Okay. So the last piece I want to point to is just really looking to, in the future of our home hardening programs, how can we provide the most cost-effective recommendations? Right now, with recommendations from the Insurance Institute of Business and Home Safety, we have incredible lists of the many tens of thousands of dollars that that a resident needs to do in order to increase the ignition resistance of their home. But in a similar approach to defensible space, we really need to align the most cost-effective recommendations with the chances of survivability that brings to the home. Thank you.
No, that's great. I really appreciate it, and thanks for sharing those lessons. I think it'd be really interesting to hear, Jana, from you about what that entire strategy looks like. You know, there's been a growingly popular narrative that says just do home hardening, forget everything else. As a scientist and as somebody who studied this, how do you answer that?
There's no one silver bullet that's going to solve all of our problems. There's definitely a whole set of facets that we need to see improvement on. You know, the recognition in the last 2 years that home hardening is a really key element and is something that has been previously not very discussed prior to this is critical, right? Because this is the built environment, right? We built the built environment, and this is something we can fix, regardless of whether the climate's changing or how it's changing or all these things. I mean, this is stuff we own, right? And so, putting it in context to all the other actions that need to take place is important, and we need to move forward on all those fronts. So, I'm excited that we're having these kind of more engaging, more dynamic conversations, both in the policy arena as well as in the private arena. And I think together we really can turn the course and build a resilient California.
I've heard you talk before about saturation levels and what percentage of homes need to be hardened. Where is the science on that? What are you learning? And where does that stand?
It's a great question. I don't have an answer to that question. I think about it a little bit from vaccination theory and this idea that we don't have to get 100% saturation on vaccinations, but we really need to build robust levels of change. And I think we have to think about it in spatial arrangements. And as we design new communities, thinking about that home hardening on the outside of those perimeters are particularly important. So the home is not backed up to the wildland, but maybe the road is backed up to the wildland, and then the home is on the inside of that. So we're backing off the edges of the steep embankments where those beautiful views are, but it's also where we get so much exposure from fires running uphill. So I don't have an easy answer to that question, but I do think it's important to recognize that your neighbor's survival is just as important as your survival, and so all communities need to work together. This is an all hands on deck. This is everybody pulling their weight, and within that, how do we protect our most vulnerable, and how do we protect those that have the least resources? And so that's where the fire safe councils and this idea of all communities working together become really important, because we can't stomach the loss of any more communities.
Yeah. And Callie Jane, you experienced that firsthand, having your own community lost to catastrophic fire. Can you tell us a little bit about a couple examples of people whose homes survived the wildfire and what that recovery looks like, and an example of someone who lost their home?
Thank you. Well, this one story that was really captivating to me, we had a couple who were part of the Paradise Ridge Fire Safe Council for many, many years, and they were just the backbone. They would show up and bring cookies to community events, and they were always there to lend a hand. They had lived on a multi-family parcel in Paradise with their mother and a sister, and had really tended their property very well, had invested in the initial round of maintenance, or fuels reduction and then maintenance, and had worked on their homes. And they had shared that when the fire flames were across the canyon and the embers were coming, they were preparing to evacuate, but they heard the embers come right into the ceiling vents up into the attic, and they could hear the attic catch on fire, and they knew that they were going to lose their house. So it was disappointing for them, because they had worked so hard to be ready for fire. And then we've also had, obviously, many people in the fire footprint whose homes did survive, and one of those was a board member of ours who was a prior fire chief for the town of Paradise. And we got to visit his home right after the fire, and we have a picture to share with you of that. And so he had, in that critical first 5 feet zone that we talk about, he had sidewalks and other kind of infrastructure that kept the embers from impending onto the structure. He'd worked a lot on raking, he'd worked a lot on defensible space, but he had this arbor, this decorative arbor, that luckily when it caught on fire, it didn't fall toward his structure, it fell away, and that was his lucky moment. But moving forward for he and his family, there's just many, many, many hurdles to get through, dealing with insurance agencies, dealing with the smoke damage, having to remove carpet and all sorts of linens and things that had to be cleaned, and then just the loss of all of the neighbors, and then the ongoing challenge with the tree removals on his property and his neighbor's property. It's just a constant battle for him, even to this day, a year later. The ramifications of having to deal with it are ongoing.
Absolutely. And I think we've invested over $1 million in hazard tree removal from Paradise alone. I think there's 600,000 hazard trees that need to be removed for people to be able to safely rebuild. So there's a lot of nuance in rebuilding after a fire. And, I know after the Detweiler fire, I met a family that had been in the evacuation zone. Their home survived, but they had been out of work for 2 weeks. And then they had lost all of their food and all of their supplies during the evacuation because even their pantry was damaged by smoke, and they hadn't had a paycheck. So they actually had to come in and try to get food for their kids because they had no money, they had nothing left in their pantry to even be able to feed their children. And so the consequences of these catastrophic fires, when they sweep through a community, are really devastating at multiple levels and can have a compounding impact, which is why it's so important that we take this three-prong approach that all of you are talking about. Like Callie Jane saw those fuel breaks work to create that survivable space outside the school, and all the work you're doing, Daniel, and Forrest really thinking through how do we hit this home hardening at scale to be able to achieve the vision and execute the science that Jana's bringing us. So thank you for taking the time to be here today. Thank you for sharing your expertise and your experience. We're going to give a round of applause to our panelists, and then we're going to have Secretary Crowfoot and Chief Porter come up and talk to us just a little bit about the Policy Foundation. So let's give a warm round of applause for our panelists today. Thank you.
Well, thank you for, that was a great panel, really articulate and resonant, just because you've been living this reality. What I want to do is start a conversation, but also open it up to questions and answers, or questions anyways. We'll try to provide some answers. But one of the questions is, Chief, can we be doing more on defensible space and home hardening? It seems like you've done remarkable work in terms of these vegetation, fuel breaks, et cetera. We haven't historically heard as much about, home hardening and even defensible space. What do you think, where are we at with that in California, and where do we need to be?
Well, thank you. Is that working?
Here, go, try this one.
I'll try yours. That one works. Thank you, Secretary. And so true. We haven't spent a lot of time really focusing on the home hardening, although it has been something that we've been advocating for. And you can look back in our pamphlets and early website even talks about home hardening. So it's not something that we weren't considering, weren't dealing with, but it is something that has been more of asking the homeowner to do that, because that's something very much a part of what they should be doing as a part of their defensible space. So how does that kind of fit into the bigger picture? And the fuels projects the work that we've been doing, and thank you very much for facilitating all that you did and agency did in order to get us through that 45-day report, and then the 35 priority projects that we're continuing to work through. Those are an example of something that we hadn't done before, and really take a fine-grained look at vulnerable communities in a different way than we have in my career, and 20-plus years, 30 when you add just my forester time to this. We haven't looked at it that way. So starting from there and finding those places on the ground that really needed that kind of work, and then tying that to the broader picture of forest health and watershed health, and working with the federal landowners to look into, how can we better preserve our watersheds, preserve our forests? Because, when we're talking about home hardening today, and every one of us lives under some sort of a home, thankfully. And so we have a perspective. It's easy to jump into that perspective of the home. But all of the wildland is another type of home, right? And all of the other aspects that we're looking at. If we were just a room of IOUs, how would we be thinking about this problem, potentially? From the linear feature of our power lines and our system grid operation. So in all that we're talking about these days that are so much wildland fire-centric, it's really a systematic approach that we need to be looking at across the board, from the furthest distant wildlands and special places to those places that are in between those chaparral-covered landscapes that provide a lot of habitat and watershed value. And then to the community, defensible space, and now we're talking very specifically about the structure.
Yeah, and I like Jessica's image of concentric circles, the home, the community, sort of the perimeter, and then the broader landscape. So, you know, the slides we saw from Jana's presentation make it seem pretty daunting in terms of really hardening your home in all the ways that you need to. And I think Forrest pointed out that, you know, the home hardening is very expensive, and that a lot of folks that actually need it the worst, or need it most importantly, don't have the resources. So what do you think are the, you know, opportunities? There's been discussions of the hazard mitigation funds through FEMA. What's underway in terms of trying to figure out how to get resources to those who need it in order to harden their homes?
Great question. And I think that is the place where we can have the biggest impact. Those who can't afford to do these things on their own really need some incentive and also some support in doing so. And I think AB 38 is going to help us work toward that. We're still kind of in the early stages of figuring out how that's going to work, how it's
Remind us what that does. What is it setting up?
it does a lot of things, but what it's going to do is set up a mechanism for funding of public funding to increase home hardening. And again, I don't want to get into detail because it's something that is being worked out how it's going to roll out. There is some disclosure element in the sales of a home, much like you have to do with earthquake and other floodplain kind of disclosure. These are things that are going to be included in that as well. So all good elements of kind of moving forward with helping the homeowner be aware of what the situation is and how they can help, work to increase the survivability of their home.
Yeah, and I think there's real interest, it seems like, from the agency, certainly from the legislature, in trying to figure out what works. I mean, part of the challenge is these are very, it's very expensive, as I understand it, to harden your home with, everything that you could possibly do. And when you multiply that by the number of homes that need it, it's, I would argue that it's, the state budget isn't big enough. But that being said, that shouldn't stop us from trying to figure out what are those incentives, maybe need-based, et cetera, where you can really get funding to the people who need it.
Right, and I totally agree. There is no way that we can publicly fund every structure that needs to be retrofitted and hardened. So we have to look at all of the above approach. We need to look at the defensible space. We need to look at the fuel reduction projects that will herd fires and reduce their impact as they come into a community, put the fire on the ground, not in the canopies, and then we need to do forest health treatment as well. And all of these things together reduce the amount of ember output from the wildlands to the structures, but they also increase the health of the rest of the ecosystem, and that's really where we need to be. We need to be at a place where fires can burn in California. Every acre that can burn will burn in California one day, and California is a very fire resilient landscape. It's us that are the problem, really. I mean, we are the ones that are in the way. We're the ones who have these kind of conversations because our stuff got damaged, right? The rest of everything that's out there is making it through. I mean, we are seeing some invasive species encroaching. That's something we need to be worried about. That's something we need to manage away from. We need to get more fire on the landscape, more fuel reduction project work through proactive means and in a healthy state. And there's good fire, bad fire, and then everything in between. Yeah,
I want to turn it over to questions, but I do want to recognize the Fire Safe Council movement. To me, there's no one-size-fits-all approach to communities, and actually having partners on the ground that understand the needs, that have credibility with homeowners is critical. So from my point of view, the more that we can actually be working with fire safe councils as like central partners in whatever programs the state sets up is really critical. Questions? And if anybody has a question and you want to shout it out, I will repeat it up here so that everybody can hear.
I have a mic too.
Thanks for the panel today. So the focus has been on homes. Are there some unique challenges or needs in commercial buildings or schools, churches, hospitals, we know, clinics, things like that? What are
Great
the
question.
needs there?
Yeah, and I don't know if Daniel wants to touch on this specifically, but they're all the same issues, just at a different scale. Often there's more of that non-combustible zone around. And before I kick it to Daniel, I was thinking when looking at the slides and kind of hearing the panelists talk, as a firefighter, what's the first thing that I do when I pull up to a house and I'm gonna have to defend this house and the fire's coming up from below me and I'm up on a ridge? What am I gonna do? I'm gonna send my firefighters all around, throwing every combustible thing as far away from the structure as possible. I'm gonna start cutting down the vegetation that's under the eaves that Forrest was mentioning. Pull that out of the way, and then hope for the best. If we have time, we'll be clearing out the leaves out of the.
But the point being that those are precious minutes that could be actually.
Right, that's stuff that we shouldn't have to do, and that's if firefighters are at that house. Which is a very small number.
It's a really good point, Daniel.
And we talk a lot about houses, obviously for the value of that being personally owned, but about 70% of all the structures that have been destroyed by these wildfires are residences. But our building code applies to all buildings. So it can be a commercial building, it can be an industrial building, it can be a residential building. The code is the same. But again, most of this focus is because residents are more likely to be destroyed by wildfires. And I think the point to take is Santa Rosa, right? A large Walmart, a concrete built infrastructure was destroyed by these fires. And that's where it comes back to, if you have embers, it only takes one weakness in there. And so all structures, though, to answer your question, are under the building code requirements.
And then Callie Jane's going to add about the hospital in Paradise.
Sure. We have a pretty significant health movement in Paradise. Our hospital and clinic and a variety of other features really supported the economy in Paradise. And so the hospital was vulnerable to fire, and there had been a lot of plans for fuels reduction around it, and a lot of work had been done for many years. The hospital has helped maintain it with a wide variety of treatments, but unfortunately the day of the fire, the hospital did come under that huge ember barrage and caught fire. And so I'm sure some of you have heard those stories of the folks who are in a variety of states of operation or childbirth or a wide variety of things that had to be evacuated out of the hospital that day. And it was quite a significant effort to save those people. And luckily, the emergency room survived the flames. And so we're hoping that there will be some policy that will allow the emergency room to open again in Paradise.
Thanks so much. Any other questions? Yeah.
What role, if any, are the insurance companies playing in this, other than making ridiculously expensive home hardening recommendations?
Good point. What role are the insurance companies playing besides making ridiculously expensive home hardening proposal or recommendations? I think it's an open question, but
It really is, and this is something, it's not new to us in this arena where wildfire has spawned massive dropping of policies, particularly in Southern California. That happened. I think it has happened with the Butte fire in Tuolumne, Calaveras, and then also out in Lake County, and it's continuing now. So it is something that we are monitoring, and it's something that we don't have a real fix for, particularly at this level. It is something that we are continuing to have conversations with insurance on, and I think it's ongoing.
Yeah, and I would say the insurance commissioner is definitely involved, and our governor and governor's office are really focused on this crisis where essentially people are being dropped from their insurance as a result of this, which is just unacceptable.
Yeah, and I'll just add. One of the reasons I was asking Jana the question about what percentage of homes need to be hardened for a community to survive is that if we can get to the core of that answer, and I know CAL FIRE's FRAP team is doing some studies on home flammability and what that might look like, that if we can get that answer, then that allows us to make a much stronger case to insurance companies to incorporate that into their fire risk models and reduce that risk. So there's some steps we need to take in terms of science and studying and understanding to be able to translate that into policy that private insurance companies can then utilize to help make sure communities keep their insurance.
That's great. Last question.
I was wondering, would it be possible to partner with the places where residents go when they're going to get work done on their homes, like Lowe's or Ace Hardware or Home Depot? Because I am a resident of Butte County and I traveled here to be here today, but I don't know how many of my other Paradise and Chico residents were able to be here this morning. But if we can meet them where they already go to seek information when they're considering renovating their homes, when they're considering doing improvements. I know over the weekend I did some yard work around my house, and unfortunately I put a bunch of combustible bark down and I spent money doing that because I didn't know.
I think it's an excellent suggestion. Daniel, you want to jump in?
Yeah, one of the things that we are going to be working on here that recent legislation, SB 190, has us focused on is providing additional education to contractors, building officials, so that they have an understanding of not just what the law says, but also what the practicality says. We've been spending time over the last couple of years doing a lot of education to the building officials, but I think the idea of partnering with some of the larger companies like Home Depot's is an excellent point. I know many of the fire safe councils around the state have held events at those kind of businesses where the fire department, CAL FIRE, has partnered to provide that education, because you're right, we want to make sure that the sales folks who are selling these materials are informed and educated about them. So valuable point, thank you.
And also they already offer like 1-hour workshops on various things, so it can just be another one of their workshops that they offer on weekends.
I love the idea, and I love the idea of trying to institutionalize it across the state, because it's one thing if a hardworking fire safe council works with a general manager who gets it at a Lowe's or Home Depot, but if we could actually interact with them at that sort of high Sacramento level and actually get them to institutionalize this. I'll tell you, when I worked for Governor Brown and we were focused on the drought, we did a similar thing, which is, all of these non-native plants were being sold by the Home Depots, the Lowe's, instead of emphasizing, the native, drought tolerant, et cetera. So we worked with them in terms of really emphasizing or promoting the low flow toilets and the drought tolerant plants, et cetera. And they actually liked it because, to your point, it was another way they could engage the customer and have the customer actually come in, which of course they love the customer spending time in their stores. So we'll take that idea. It's an excellent one, and build on what you're already talking about.
Jessica had suggested I would just share real quickly. We did do an event with our local Home Depot in October before the campfire. And, we had our booth out there and a few folks trickled over and looked at it. So that's the kind of capacity we've been able to give to that kind of a partnership, but we do need the muster from a state level. The thing that I'm excited to share with you guys is that we are looking to offer a course this coming spring in Butte County called Firescaping. And we find that people really want to talk about plants. They love their yards. They love talking about trees. And when we approach it from a defensible space standpoint, sometimes it's just too hard and too boring of a subject. And so we're going to try to meet with people with their heart space about planting and gardening based on a book that's been published called Firescaping. And so anyone who's interested in joining us on that journey will be looking at some of the materials we want to use and offering a sort of a semi-certification for someone who wants to get firescaping.
That's a great idea, and the kind of creativity we need to bring to this. So we're at one thing that we do with these secretary series is stay on time so that you'll come back and know you can just spend an hour with us. So I'll close, but I'll just close thanking our panelists, obviously, and thanking the people in this room that either work here at the agency or work in their own communities. And then lastly, Chief, I want to thank the men and women over the last 6 weeks that have really taken some really catastrophic conditions between the winds and the fires and saved a ton of lives in the process. I will say, I think about the growing awareness of the need to evacuate as one real success story of this fire season. In places like Healdsburg and Windsor, people got out, and then it gave your firefighters time to actually defend the city. Remarkable stories of people actually seeing the videos from their Nest cameras outside of their doors of the firefighters coming in and defending their homes. And as I understand it, they were able to do more of that work because they weren't busy helping people evacuate who should have evacuated earlier. So I think about home hardening as one of these things too, where in hopefully 3 to 5 years, there's much greater consciousness. Firescaping has taken off as the new thing. We have more data about what are the most cost-effective ways to do this, and we have a growing movement. It's definitely our commitment here at the agency to help elevate this. We have strong legislative partners. We have a governor who gets it, and I think together we can continue to make progress. So thanks everyone for being here, and have a great week.